Los Angeles, early 1970s. Night pressed against the windows, thick and quiet. The kind of quiet that settles only after midnight, when decent people are asleep and indecent offers feel safer to make. The phone rang in Dean Martin's living room. Not the polite kind of ring. Not a mistake. The kind that carries weight before you even pick it up. Dean looked at it for a long second, cigarette burning down between his fingers. Phones rang late for only two reasons back then: money or trouble. Sometimes both. He answered. The voice on the line was calm, distant, Eastern. No flattery, no warmth. $500,000. Cash. One night, the man said. You appear on stage in a clown costume. My birthday. No jokes. No songs. You're part of the show. Silence followed. Not static. Real silence. Dean didn't respond right away. He wasn't the smiling Rat Pack favorite anymore. His son's name had just hit the papers for all the wrong reasons. Contracts were slipping. Invitations were thinning. Reputation, once effortless, now needed defending. And now this. $500,000. For humiliation. The man on the line waited, confident money would do what it always did. But Dean finally spoke, not to accept, not to refuse. He asked one question. Tell me something, he said quietly. Who else will be in the room? From that moment on, the night stopped being about money and started becoming something far more dangerous. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The phone rang late, the way phones only rang when nothing good followed. Dean Martin had been sitting in the half-light of his living room, jacket still on, tie loosened, a glass untouched on the table beside him. The television murmured to itself, a rerun of something he barely recognized. He let the phone ring once more before answering, already tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. By the early 70s, his name still carried weight, but it no longer moved rooms the way it once had. The laughter came slower. The applause felt polite. Ratings reports arrived wrapped in smiles and excuses. He drank more than he meant to, not for pleasure, not for drama, but because silence had grown heavier than liquor. Fame, he had learned, didn't vanish. It thinned. The voice on the line was calm, professionally warm. An intermediary, someone who spoke as if money were weather, inevitable, impersonal. The offer came quickly, almost apologetically. A private birthday. Absolute discretion. No press. No recordings. The sum followed, and for a moment Dean thought he'd misheard. He asked for it again. It was repeated without emphasis, like a fact. He didn't laugh. There were conditions. Total secrecy. A contract thick enough to bruise a desk, and one detail delivered at the end, lightly, as if it were a courtesy rather than a demand. A costume. Not playful. Not ironic. Specific. Humiliating by design. When the call ended, the room felt smaller. Dean stayed seated, the receiver still warm in his hand. He didn't pour the drink. He stared at the wall where old photographs hung, moments frozen when everything had seemed endless. He thought of his children, of alimony schedules, of the quiet fear that followed every canceled show, every polite, "We'll talk." His manager arrived an hour later, breathless, eyes already calculating damage. He had made calls. Quiet ones. The kind that didn't leave records. The party wasn't just a party. It was a gathering of donors, men who influenced policy without appearing in photographs, men who collected leverage the way others collected art. Then came another name, Elvis Presley. Same offer. Months earlier. Same terms, same costume. Refused without explanation. That detail landed harder than the money ever could. Elvis didn't turn down easy checks, not without reason. They dug deeper, carefully. The costume wasn't a joke. It had been used before. Lesser-known performers, desperate ones. Each time, silence bought. Careers untouched on paper, diminished everywhere else. The host enjoyed control, not spectacle. Alone again, Dean sat in the dark. Pride told him to hang up and forget the number. Responsibility whispered louder. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't brave for free. But he understood something about rooms, about men who needed to be watched, even when they believed they owned the air. By morning, he made one request. No commitment. No signature. Just a meeting. Face to face. On the other end of the line, there was a pause. Brief, calculating, before the answer came. "Yes," the voice said. "That can be arranged." New York in winter had its own kind of arrogance. Black cars gliding through slush, doormen standing like sentries, steam rising from grates, as if the city itself were exhaling secrets. Dean rode up in silence, the elevator whispering past floors that looked identical in their expensive restraint. His manager had wanted to come. Dean had said no. Some meetings you didn't outsource. The penthouse opened onto a room that felt more like a museum than a home. Pale walls, carefully placed light, furniture chosen the way weapons were chosen, for effect. A bar stood ready, but no one offered him a drink. A man in an immaculate suit waited near the windows, hands loose at his sides, posture relaxed in the way only the truly untouchable could manage. He wasn't flamboyant. He didn't perform his wealth. He had the controlled face of someone who had spent a lifetime buying time, loyalty, outcomes. He smiled at Dean with a polite thinness, like acknowledging a famous antique. "Mr. Martin," he said, voice even. "Thank you for coming." Dean didn't rush to shake his hand. He let the moment sit. It was a small choice, almost nothing, but it established a boundary. He took in the view behind. The man, city lights scattered like coins on black velvet. And then the lack of personal clutter. No family photographs, no warmth, just possession. The host gestured toward a chair. Dean remained standing. "I'm told you want to discuss the terms," the man said. "I want to understand why," Dean replied. That earned a slight tilt of the head, as if Dean had asked an interesting question rather than an inconvenient one. "Why is simple," the man said. "I don't need an entertainer. I need a symbol." He said it the way a collector spoke about a rare piece. No emotion, no shame. Dean felt something tighten behind his ribs, not anger yet, but recognition. He had met men who loved applause. This one loved compliance. The man walked to a side table where folders were arranged with precision. He slid one forward. The contract looked like it had been drafted for war. Discretion clauses, penalties, a list of forbidden actions so long it seemed designed to erase spontaneity itself. "You'll notice," the man said, "how carefully it protects you. No publicity, no recordings, no guests allowed to speak publicly about the evening." "Protects me," Dean echoed softly. The man's smile did not change. "Protects all of us." Dean flipped a page, scanning without hurrying. He had learned long ago that speed looked like hunger. He listened more than he spoke. And as the host explained the event, private, curated, powerful, Dean watched his eyes, the tiny pauses before certain words, the moments where enjoyment almost surfaced and then was suppressed. Then the man leaned forward, voice lowering as if sharing intimacy. "You've been through enough to appreciate privacy," he said. "Your father, your early jobs, the things you did before anyone cared who you were." Dean's fingers stopped on the paper. Some of it had been written about. Most hadn't. Names, places, details that never made newspapers, a debt, a fight, a phone call he'd made once in Detroit and regretted ever since. The host recited them without triumph, like reading inventory. It wasn't gossip. It was proof of reach. Dean forced himself to keep his face steady. Inside, a cold line formed. This man had studied pain the way other men studied markets. And one more condition, the host added, almost gently. Last minute, I'm afraid. Necessary. He opened a small box on the table. Inside lay a bright red clown nose, absurd against the sterile room. He set it beside the contract like punctuation. You will not speak, he said. Not one word. No ad-lib. No song. No clever remark to soften the edges. Even if they laugh. Even if they push. Dean stared at the nose. The demand wasn't about silence. It was about stripping him of the only weapon he'd ever used to survive. His voice. He looked up. The host met his gaze without blinking. The city reflected faintly in the glass, behind him, turning him into a dark shape framed by lights. Dean let a long pause stretch, long enough that the air began to feel crowded. He imagined the headlines that would never be printed, the humiliation that would never technically exist. He thought of Elvis refusing and saying nothing. He thought of men who believed contracts could replace consent. Finally, Dean nodded once. Yes, he said quietly. The host exhaled, as if he'd won something inevitable. He reached for a pen. Dean did not smile back. But in his eyes, something shifted, measured, alert, as if he'd just agreed to enter a room where he intended to see everything. The costume arrived 2 days later in a plain cardboard box. No return address, no flourish. Dean watched it sit in the hallway for nearly an hour before touching it, as if proximity alone might explain it. When he finally opened the lid, the smell came first. Synthetic fabric, faintly sweet, like something meant for children and cheap laughter. Folded neatly inside lay the suit, brighter than it had any right to be, colors aggressive under the soft California light. He lifted it with 2 fingers. It was heavier than expected, stiff in the shoulders. The inside seams scratched his skin when he tested the sleeve. Nothing about it invited movement. Everything about it restricted it. For the first time in decades, Dean rehearsed without sound. He stood alone in the living room, television off, curtains half drawn, practicing stillness. No timing jokes, no raised eyebrow, no gentle croon to soften a room. He tested how long he could hold eye contact with an empty chair, how slowly he could move without looking unsure. Silence wasn't absence, he realized. It was pressure. Between rehearsals, he read the contract again. Not front to back, he knew it too well by now, but sideways, looking for weakness. That's when he saw it. A clause buried deep, written with lawyerly caution. Verbal communication prohibited. Nothing else specified. No ban on gesture. No limits on presence. One gesture. Singular. Undefined. It sat there like a loose floorboard. The phone rang just after midnight. Dean considered letting it go. Something told him not to. The voice on the other end was familiar. Older now. Roughened by years of rooms like this one. Someone who had once been family, once been part of nights that felt invincible. You still going through with it? The voice asked without greeting. For now, Dean said. There was a pause, heavier than the others had been. Elvis didn't walk away because of the money, the voice said. He walked away because he saw the trap. That room doesn't forget. It waits. Dean didn't ask how the caller knew. In their world, knowledge traveled without explanation. Another detail surfaced the next morning, delivered quietly by his manager, who sounded uneasy saying it. One of the guests expected that night was a man who had ended a promising career with a phone call years earlier. Not out of malice, out of convenience. A friend of Dean's had disappeared after that call. No scandal, just silence. The timing wasn't coincidence. Dean tried the costume on once. Just once. The mirror showed a stranger shaped like him, colors swallowing his frame, dignity reduced to geometry. He removed it slowly, carefully folding it back into the box as if it might bruise. The waiting became the hardest part. Anticipation gnawed louder than fear. Every hour stretched, each quiet moment filling with imagined rooms, imagined laughter. He did not drink. He wanted his edges sharp. On the evening of the party, music drifted through the open doors of a distant hall, already alive without him. Dean stood in the corridor, costume on, hands bare, breathing steady. The doors opened. Light spilled out. Conversation faltered. And Dean stepped forward into the room, carrying silence like a loaded thing. The room absorbed him before anyone decided how to react. Crystal chandeliers threw soft light onto polished faces, tuxedos, dresses chosen for discretion rather than beauty. Power sat comfortably here. It always did. Conversations slowed, then fractured, like ice under a careful step. Dean stood where the host had indicated, slightly elevated, visible from every angle. No microphone, no band cue. Just him in the costume, colors too loud against the wealth-muted palette of the room. For a breath, nothing happened. Then a laugh broke loose near the bar. Short, uncertain. It wasn't amusement. It was relief, the sound people made when they wanted permission to feel superior. Another followed. A few smiles appeared, rehearsed and shallow. They were waiting for the joke to start, for humiliation to arrive on schedule. Dean did nothing. He let his hands rest at his sides. He didn't bow, didn't wave. He looked out, eyes moving slowly, deliberately, from face to face. He met gazes without challenge, without warmth, simply present. The laughter thinned, trailing off like a bad idea abandoned mid-sentence. Glass clinked somewhere. Someone cleared their throat. The silence thickened, unfamiliar and unwelcome. A woman near the front shifted in her chair. A man leaned toward his companion, whispering something sharp and annoyed. This wasn't how these evenings worked. Entertainment was meant to absorb discomfort, not create it. Dean took a step forward, unhurried. The sound of his shoe against the floor landed too loudly. He stopped, then slowly lowered himself into a chair placed for effect more than comfort. The fabric creaked. He crossed his ankles, posture calm, controlled. From the corner of his eye, he saw the host stiffen. A small gesture followed, almost nothing. Dean slid one glove off, finger by finger, and set it neatly beside the chair. The movement drew attention the way a held breath did. People leaned in without realizing they were doing it. His gaze continued its circuit. Not accusatory, observant. He wasn't performing. He was witnessing. For men and women used to being invisible behind influence, it was deeply unsettling. Someone murmured, barely audible, "He's not playing." Another voice answered, lower still, "He's watching." The host rose from his seat, smile fixed too carefully in place. He made a subtle motion with his hand, the kind meant to trigger action. Nothing happened. No cue, no correction. The room no longer belonged to him alone. Dean tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the movement without responding to it. The silence stretched further, pressing against the walls. Breathing grew audible. The soft hum of the city outside crept in through the glass. In that quiet, something shifted. Power didn't vanish, but it redistributed, uncertain, unsteady. The guests felt it before they understood it. For the first time that night, no one laughed. The host's smile remained, but it no longer reached his eyes. It held, rigid, as the room settled into a stillness it could not buy its way out of. The music returned without conviction. Strings murmured from hidden speakers, polished and distant, as if embarrassed to be present. No one listened. Every eye stayed anchored to the same place, drawn there by an absence that had become weight. The host moved closer. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Men like him were used to rooms adjusting around their tone. He stopped just short of Dean's chair, smile sharpened, posture open in a way that suggested generosity rather than threat. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked lightly, for everyone to hear. It was the first spoken challenge of the evening, and it cracked something open. A few guests exhaled, grateful. Sound meant structure. Sound meant safety. Dean did not look away. He did not nod. He did not respond. The host chuckled, just enough to suggest control. "You know," he continued, pacing a half step to the side, "people expect a little effort, especially at this level." A ripple moved through the crowd. Not laughter, anticipation. They leaned forward, sensing collision. Dean remained still. The host leaned in closer now, voice lowered but not private. "Your very expensive silence, Mr. Martin." That was the mistake. The man who had purchased quiet could not tolerate it. He filled the void himself, word by word, dismantling his own terms in public. The irony went unnoticed by him, and by almost no one else. Dean's hand moved, slowly, deliberately, without drama. He reached up, fingers steady, and removed the red clown nose. No flourish, no pause for effect. He simply took it off and held it for a second longer than necessary. Then he placed it on the table between them. The sound it made was barely audible, a soft, hollow tap, plastic against polished wood. The room froze. The gesture did not belong to the audience. It wasn't theatrical. It was specific, targeted. Those who understood power felt it immediately, like a temperature drop. Someone near the back inhaled sharply. The host's smile faltered for the first time. His eyes flicked down to the nose, then back up. Something old and unwelcome passed through his face before discipline reclaimed it. A man seated 2 rows over stiffened, recognition dawning too late. A woman turned her head, studying the host with new interest, memory connecting dots she had avoided for years. Whispers began, not about Dean, but about him. "That story," someone murmured. "I thought that was buried." "So it was him?" The clown nose sat there, absurd and devastating, transforming the table into a stage no one had consented to stand on. Dean said nothing. He didn't need to. The host straightened, trying to recover ground that no longer existed. He laughed once, sharp and brittle. "Very clever," he said, but the room didn't follow. Then a single clap echoed. One hand, one person, slow, deliberate. Another followed. Not applause, acknowledgement. The sound spread unevenly, hesitant but unstoppable. Not for entertainment, for something else entirely. The host stepped back, isolated now, the object on the table between him and the room like an accusation no contract could erase. The applause did not grow. It didn't need to. It lingered, uneven and restrained, then dissolved into something quieter and far more damaging. Distance. Guests turned slightly away from the host, not rudely, not obviously, just enough. Bodies angled. Conversations resumed elsewhere, deliberately excluding the space around him. The party, by all visible measures, continued. In reality, it was over. Music still played. Glasses were refilled. Laughter surfaced in pockets. Too loud, too forced. No one was listening anymore. The center of gravity had shifted, and everyone felt it. The host stood motionless for a moment longer than etiquette allowed. His expression rearranged itself with effort. He gestured once, sharply, toward the edge of the room. Security. Two men near the wall noticed the signal. They exchanged a look. One adjusted his jacket. Neither moved. They had been hired for order, not for this. There was no disturbance to correct, no rule broken. Only a quiet that had changed ownership. Behind the host, his attorney leaned in, breath close to his ear. The words were barely formed, but their meaning landed hard. "He didn't violate anything," the lawyer murmured. "Not a single clause." The host's jaw tightened. Contracts were supposed to be weapons. Tonight, they had turned inward. Dean remained seated through it all, gaze lowered now, as if the room had finally exhausted itself. He did not acknowledge the applause that had already faded. He did not wait for permission. He stood. The movement drew eyes again, but differently this time. Not expectant, observant. He stepped down from the platform and walked toward the exit at an unremarkable pace. No one stopped him. No one spoke. A narrow path opened naturally, guests shifting aside with instinctive respect, the way people moved for something they didn't fully understand, but knew not to obstruct. There was no finale, no bow, just departure. In a side corridor, away from the chandeliers and curated warmth, a man waited with a briefcase. He did not smile. He did not thank Dean. He opened the case. Cash, neatly stacked. Counted twice already. Dean took it without ceremony. The weight surprised him, not the amount, but what it represented. He nodded once. The man closed the case and disappeared back into the machinery of the evening. Outside, night air cut clean and sharp. Dean paused, just long enough to breathe without witnesses. There was no relief, no surge of triumph, only the understanding that consequences did not announce themselves. They unfolded. Behind him, the party limped on, hollowed out, pretending nothing essential had happened. Inside him, something settled, quietly, permanently. By morning, the silence would feel different. Weeks passed without headlines. No columnist hinted at a scandal. No late-night host made a joke. The city swallowed the night the way it swallowed everything else, efficiently, without fingerprints. Yet in certain rooms, the host's name began to arrive like an awkward smell, faint but impossible to ignore. Invitations stopped first, not dramatically, not with explanations. A secretary would promise a return call and never place it. A private club would claim a scheduling issue. A seat at a charity table would be reassigned with practiced politeness. For a man who lived on access, that was extinction. In that world, you didn't fall from grace. You were quietly removed from the list. Dean heard about it indirectly, from people who talked too fast and laughed too much when they mentioned the man. They sounded relieved, and that told him more than any confession could. He also heard from his agent, one afternoon when the sunlight looked tired and the house felt too still. A new offer had come in, not the kind that made a career. No television special, no grand payday. A private performance, small and unrecorded, for an audience that could not improve his ratings or his legend. A charity event, but not the glamorous kind. A room of men and women who didn't dress for cameras because no cameras would be there. People with medical bills, missing limbs, tired eyes. The organizer's message was simple. They trusted him. Dean stared at the paper for a long time. Trust was rarer than applause. He said yes. The venue was modest, the lighting plain. No chandeliers, no marble. The backstage smelled of coffee and old wood. Dean stood in a simple suit, hands steady. When he walked out, the applause wasn't curated. It was human, clumsy, sincere, uneven in rhythm because some hands didn't work the way they used to. He sang that night, not to conquer a room, to give it back something it had lost. Afterward, a young performer approached him in the hallway. Not a star. Not yet. A man with nervous energy and a cheap tie, eyes bright with the kind of hunger Dean recognized from his own early years. "I was there," the young man said quietly. Dean didn't pretend not to understand. "I didn't know what you were doing at first," the man admitted. "Then, when you set it down on that table—" He stopped, swallowing. "I realized you didn't have to shout to change the temperature of a room." Dean held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. No lecture, no advice, just acknowledgement, like passing a match without making a speech about fire. Back home later, the box of money sat in his study where he couldn't avoid it. He opened it only once. The bills stared up at him, clean and indifferent. He ran a hand over the top stack, feeling the texture, the strange warmth of paper that had cost someone else nothing, and had cost him more than he wanted to admit. He thought of his children, of obligations, of the years when he had said yes too quickly, then paid for it in ways he couldn't invoice. He also thought of the friend who had vanished after that phone call long ago, the one the industry had erased without needing a public fight. Dean took part of the money and set it aside, not neatly, not proudly. The rest he packed into an envelope with no name on the outside, only an address he had kept in his memory, like an unpaid debt. He mailed it himself. No assistance, no publicity, just a quiet errand on an ordinary day. That night, he sat alone in his living room again, television off, the house breathing around him. His fame hadn't returned to its peak. His ratings didn't surge. But something else had shifted. Something harder to measure and harder to buy. He had not spoken a single word in that penthouse. And yet, somewhere in New York, certain people had learned what silence could do. Some of them, for the first time in their lives, didn't know what to say.